Of course, we have the colloquium next week, same time, same place, as always. So, any announcements? Okay, good. All right, so we're really happy to have Dr. David Resnik here from NIEHS, the National Institutes of Environmental Health and Safety, just down the road. He has a PhD in philosophy from that other North Carolina school, UNC Chapel Hill, and a JD from the Concord University School of Law. He also has a BA in philosophy from Davidson, another school down the road. And he's been a professor at both Eastern Carolina University as well as at University of Wyoming in Laramie, which is a beautiful place. I've been there. All the rocks, that place where you can climb all the rocks.
Beautiful.
Yeah, the devil's something. It's really beautiful. But he's been the director of 2 ethics centers at those universities, and he's had a very prominent career in bioethics, including research ethics, and he's thought a lot about the ethics of genetic engineering, both on the human side as well as other sides. And he's now the chair of the NIEHS Institutional Review Board. So thank you for being here. I should also mention he's a AAAS fellow, which is a big deal. So that's an honor that's not bestowed on many. So let's welcome him.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope my voice holds out because I just got finished doing a 1.5 hour interview. So hopefully I'll be able to get through this without any problems. So I'm talking about community engagement today in field trials of genetically modified mosquitoes, and just give you sort of the background. I think you're probably familiar with the problem of mosquito-borne diseases. Accounts for 70% of all infectious disease worldwide, 1 million deaths per year. Yeah, the most dangerous by far are mosquitoes, carry malaria, dengue, Zika, yellow fever, West Nile virus. There's statistics on malaria, and the most dangerous one of these mosquito species is Aedes aegypti, who transmit dengue, Zika, malaria, other diseases to humans. These are the people infected with malaria worldwide and killed by the disease, mostly children. Some statistics on dengue fever. You can see up there. Between 50 and 100 million people contracted annually. 22,000 die from the fever. These are some of the areas at risk, most risk for dengue fever. And then, just a few years ago, you probably were aware of the Zika virus emerging as a public health threat. And this was not really a very serious problem for adults. You just get a sort of a mild infection, fever, rash, headache, and some tolerable symptoms, but a very serious problem for neonates, unborn children. It affects pregnancy and led to increased risk for microcephaly, in which the conditions in which the infant's head is abnormally small, which can lead to all kinds of problems that you can imagine, brain damage and things like that. So, in terms of responding to these mosquito-borne diseases, I mean, one way is just to treat the disease, right? Just get treatment for malaria. We have treatments for malaria, not all these other diseases, but malaria is a good example where we do have some treatment. The problem are, there's a lot of problems with treatment. It's really not the best sort of option for dealing with mosquito-borne diseases, although of course you want treatment as an option. I mean, the problem is you treat people after they're already sick, and so they're already suffering, you already have to deal with all their symptoms, they've already gotten the disease. We often say that prevention is better than cure. Treatment may be expensive, may be inaccessible. In many diseases like Zika and things like that, there may be no effective treatment. Other kinds of prevention, we have things like protective clothing, insect repellent. These are not always available or effective. We put on insect repellent around here, we still get bitten by mosquitoes, protective clothing and things like that. We have some other ways of prevention, basically mosquito control. So using pesticides to kill mosquitoes. draining the wetlands, which if we hadn't done that in the southeast years ago, we wouldn't be able to live here, and we're going to have a wetland here pretty soon again. But you know, there are problems with this. You know, there's environmental and health risks of trying to drain the wetlands. I mean, you're interfering with the environment, and wetlands play an important role in the environment. And so, you know, is that how you're going to control mosquitoes? It's a trade-off you have to make. There's also with pesticides the problem of pesticide resistance. You get start using them, you get pesticide, and also of course the risks of pesticides themselves. Things like DDT, we are well known for the risks to wildlife and potential risks to humans, but other pesticides have risks to humans and wildlife as well. So these are not sort of perfect ways of dealing with the problem. So what has come along in the last, I guess, about 10 years or so is sort of a biotechnology solution to mosquito-borne diseases. So one of the ways is to control the mosquito population itself. So this is not really all that different from other ways of just trying to make mosquitoes infertile so they can't breed and things like that. We've done that before without using genetic engineering, but this is a genetic engineering way. Another is to actually modify the mosquito population so that it cannot transmit the disease. So what has been done? Scientists at Oxitec, a private company, have developed this method for genetically modifying the male mosquitoes for Aedes aegypti so that the offspring will die prematurely unless they receive the antibiotic tetracycline. And so it's basically, they're not going to get access to that antibiotic in the wild, so they're going to die. So you release the males into the population, they breed with the females, and then the offspring are basically, you know, infertile. They're going to be born and everything, but they're going to die before they can reach maturity and breed again. So this is a way of reducing the population of mosquitoes. Now, of course, the benefits of this are that you prevent disease by reducing the mosquito population. And that's something that we're already doing by other means, right, with pesticides and draining wetlands and things like that, trying to control the population. There are some concerns about the environmental effects of this, though. I think one of the issues is that, you know, if you reduce the population of this mosquito, there are going to be possible effects on down the food chain for fish and aquatic life and insects and bats and things like that that feed on the mosquito. Of course, you're going to have that same problem when you use pesticides or drain the swamps or whatever, but that's still an issue that needs to be considered. There's also some possibility that you may sort of eliminate or you know, degrade this species, and then another species of mosquito will take its place, right? So you won't be eliminating all mosquitoes. There will still be plenty of mosquitoes around for bats to eat and other animals in the food chain, but this one will have, there'll be a negative impact on that particular species. As far as the risks to human health, they are largely non-existent. Now, that may be an overstatement, but there are always risks. But one of the risks that some people have been worried about is that if you release one of these mosquitoes into the wild, they will bite people and then, you know, infect people or something like that. But this is not likely because we're talking about males, and males don't bite. Right? They just live to reproduce. They're not taking a blood meal or anything like that. So that is not really a major concern in terms of public health. So another method that is under development and not tested in the field yet, and by the way, the previous one has been tested in the field, and we'll talk about that, how that's gone, is to genetically modify mosquitoes so they resist a particular disease or are incapable of transmitting it to humans even if they can get the disease. So the way to do this is, what you would do is you would develop this mutation, introduce it into mosquitoes, and then attach it to a gene drive mechanism Are you all familiar with gene drive and what that does and how it distorts inheritance and things like that, so it can increase the prevalence of a gene in the population against the pull of natural selection and random drift, right? It's a way of really rapidly driving a gene into the population in terms of prevalence. So you do that so that it will spread through the population rapidly, and then pretty soon you'll have a population that has this mutation that makes it incapable of transmitting this disease. So you basically vaccinated the mosquito, genetically vaccinated. So one of the benefits, of course, it prevents disease without the environmental impact of depleting the mosquito population, because we're not eliminating this species, we're not depleting it, we're just allowing it to exist, we're just vaccinating it or whatever. There are some potential negative health effects, though. The intervention might not work and might have unintended negative effects. So it's conceivable that you transmit one of these genes to try to make it so the mosquito cannot carry the targeted disease. Let's say you try to stop it from carrying malaria, and you've altered the mosquito's immune system or whatever part of the system you're interfering with, so that it now actually is better at say transmitting Zika or Dengue or another disease. So it might not be perfect, right? It could even be, ironically, be better at carrying the very targeted disease. So there are definitely problems with making sure that you get this right and you try to reduce the risk of something like this, because you are going to have mosquitoes done this way that are going to be biting people and potentially then transmitting diseases to them. Another problem is just the general problem of introducing gene drive mechanisms into the environment. And this has been looked at in other contexts. The problem really is that the gene drive mechanism itself could get out of the mosquito species through things like horizontal gene transfer, where a virus infects a mosquito and then it can transmit it to another animal, or it could go into other ways down the ecosystem. And so what you could have is that you've got this gene drive mechanism you've put out there, and now it's affecting other species and starting to drive other genes into the environment with unpredictable effects. You just don't know what could possibly happen once the gene drive mechanism is out there. I think this is a pretty low risk, but it's still something that needs to be considered. So, in terms of the field trials, what's been done is releasing mosquitoes in a particular area where prevention of mosquito-borne diseases is of paramount importance in terms of public health. These areas have been areas that have been geographically isolated to limit the spread of the GM population, so you don't, if you want to try to contain it in some particular island or some particular area where these are the only places where you'll have the mosquitoes, try to minimize the environmental impacts. There are also issues, of course, with this of getting the appropriate legal and regulatory approvals. In the US, it's FDA. There's also state and local types of regulations you have to deal with to get this approved. Now, as far as human subjects are concerned, you don't really need human subjects review or approval if you're not collecting data on individual research subjects. So even though people are affected by this, they're not actually considered human subjects for the purposes of the federal regulations unless you are performing an intervention on them specifically, or trying to alter them specifically, or you are gathering data on them specifically. So you can do this without involving human subjects, though. Now, obviously, it would be very interesting if you're going to do one of these field trials to do it on human subjects, right? To collect data on people before and after the field trial, and to look at disease in them and things like that, to see if they, if they've got what changes there have been in human subjects. But you can do this, you can get useful data without actually involving human subjects by looking at the changes in the mosquito population itself that you monitor with a field trial, and also the changes in the disease prevalence, like say you're looking at, say, the prevalence of, say, malaria, or say, let's say dengue would be the one that would be the appropriate one, before and after the field trial to see if you've changed that. And you can get that from public health records without involving human subjects. So, but even if you're not going to involve human subjects in this, and also actually even if you are involving human subjects, community engagement is crucial for something like this because members of the community will be impacted. So they will be living in an area where, you know, there's going to be these mosquitoes out there in the environment, and they could be interacting with these mosquitoes in some way, and mosquitoes could also be interacting with other species in their environment. So they're concerned about this. So the idea, you know, of community engagement is the community should have the right to review, approve, and ask questions about the field trials. It just shouldn't be done without approval of the local community. It's important for showing respect for community autonomy and dignity, as well as its values and concerns. Just from a very practical point of view, this improves success of the field trial and helps to gain acceptance of the field trial if you have the local community, you know, wanting this to happen instead of resisting you at every step or something like this. And it also presents a learning opportunity for researchers who take community engagement seriously to really learn about, you know, what the needs and concerns are of the community, what kind of things they need to know, the educational opportunities, and things like that. So part of the issue with community engagement, though, is actually defining what the community is. Because there really are different types of communities if you think about it. You know, you could have cultural communities, Tar Heel basketball fans, right? Or Wolfpack basketball fans, right? That in some sense maybe they're a community, right? You can have ethnic, racial, gender communities, communities organized by sexual orientation, religious communities, political communities, on and on and on. You can think about all these different ways of characterizing someone as belonging to a community, and these might not be appropriate ways of really thinking about the community for this type of community engagement. So the way I like to think of this community is, you know, define it geographically. These are people living in a particular area. That's what makes you a member of the community. Now, obviously, there's going to be a tremendous amount of diversity in terms of race and gender and age and income and all that, but if we just you know, located in terms of a particular area. That does bring up the problem, though, of what about nearby communities, and where do you cut it off? Let's suppose you're going to release. Let's suppose we were going to release the mosquitoes in some county in eastern North Carolina. Well, then what about an adjoining county? What are their concerns? Could they be concerned that the mosquitoes, you know, released in this particular county are going to come over to their county, right? How can you stop that? So I think even if you try to, you know, geographically isolate a community and say, look, this is the community of concern, there's still the problem of how to worrying about nearby communities and how you make that cutoff in terms of what communities actually need to be engaged for this whole process. There are other constituencies as well that I think you have to think about in terms of their role in this whole community engagement process. So you have environmental groups. So they may have a very strong stake in these field trials and feel like they should try to influence whether these field trials are done or not. And then the question, you know, arises whether you should allow some outside group to influence whether the field trial is done, or whether it should be just the local community that has the say in whether the field trial is done. But of course, it might just not be environmental groups. It might be industry pushing for this to happen, right? You know, they're wanting this to happen, and so they want to try to really influence the decision made by the community and the regulators and everybody else. as well, obviously, as scientists is another sort of constituency that you would have to consider. Another thing to think about with community engagement is what does it mean to engage? Well, I think at the very minimal it means to interact with someone, but that doesn't seem to be all that meaningful, just to interact with the community. Well, informing the community, that seems a little bit more. Consulting with the community, that's a little bit more. Educating the community. But I think where the really big issue here, and I think this is would be interesting for discussion, is whether the community should have to consent and what that would mean for community engagement, that the community should have the ability to say no, right, for a particular field trial, if that's what it takes to have good community engagement. So I would say that it's something that does involve that. So here's how I would look at it. Community engagement is a partnership between public health researchers or officials and community members that includes the exchange of information, ideas, and opinions, mutual respect for values and interests, and shared decision-making. Now, to me, that shared decision-making implies that the community, in some fashion or other, is going to consent to the field trial or not for it to go forward. What does it mean for a community to consent? There's some people that argue that really informed consent doesn't mean anything at all when you're talking about community, because informed consent is most applicable to when you have an individual making a decision, like, say, for medical, having a medical procedure done, surgery, or participating in an experiment. Yeah, you can have an individual having informed consent, but what would it mean for a community? Well, I think we could talk about community consent in a similar way if we can come up with some kind of, or we can say that the community has some kind of fair and effective political process for making decisions. Okay, so this could vary. Maybe it's made by a local planning board, county commissioners, local government, other leaders, community leaders and things, local referendum voting, different ways that communities could make decisions, and we could say, yes, this is a fair and effective method for the community to make the decision, and so we will consider this kind of decision-making to be fair and effective community engagement. This does bring up the issue, though, of minority rights. If we're looking at something like some sort of democratic process here, like we would have in the United States and a lot of other, industrialized nations, what if, there's a strong minority in the community, the majority wants a field trial to happen, but there's a strong minority in the community that says, no, we don't want the field trial to happen? Can they trump the will of the majority and just basically say, no, we can't do this? Now, I would argue that majority rule is a legitimate method for making public decisions in democratic societies because it treats all members as having equal political standing. So if you think about it, if we didn't have majority rule, if we said that a minority could stop something from happening, that would be basically giving a minority people more voting rights, more rights than the majority, because they're less, but they're still getting to make the decision. However, there should still be some limits on majority rule to protect some basic rights and liberties possessed by all citizens, such as freedom of expression, freedom of religion, legal due process, and so forth. So if you approve a law, a law approved by majority rule should not strip people of their basic rights and liberties. Now, it's an interesting question is whether not being exposed to genetically modified mosquitoes is one of those basic rights and liberties. But you might argue that it's really not on the same level as something like freedom of expression or freedom of religion, something like that. Also, you could argue that democratic decision-making should include strategies for reaching out to all citizens, especially racial or ethnic minorities, or socially economically disadvantaged groups to ensure they have the opportunity for meaningful input into public decision making. So that's kind of sort of a supplement to the majority rule, is not just that it be, things like voting and things like that, but that you actually have mechanisms for reaching out to people that might not have the same degree of power, or might be, not be as much a part of the political process unless you bring them into it. So here's some strategies for this democratic decision making. Obviously, things like public forums, town meetings, media campaigns, door-to-door information sharing and gathering, surveys, outreach to disadvantaged groups, voting procedures. So these are all things that people have argued should, we tend to think of democracy maybe as something like this, but really there's a lot of other ways of promoting democratic decision making than just voting on things. So another thing about community engagement, I think it's important, it's not just important for democracy and the political process, but the idea of environmental justice. So the environmental justice movement emerged in the US in the 1980s when minority communities objected to the placement of waste sites in their neighborhoods without their input or approval. And this has been an ongoing issue about, how different communities are affected by, exposures to environmental risks and what kind of say they should have in it. So the idea is that these environmental risks should be just or fair. Now, there's different ways of looking at sort of justice or fairness here. It could be in terms of the outcome. So an outcome is fair if it leads to a fair distribution of the benefits and burdens of this particular intervention. So for a field trial to be fair in this sense, you have to say, well, the community members should not be unduly burdened by the field trial, by the risks of the trial without compensating benefits. And you could make an argument based on this that, well, look, it is fair because you're getting this benefit, right? You are concerned about these risks, but there's also the disease prevention benefit. So really, to really figure out whether something is fair in this sense, there has to be a careful evaluation of the benefits and risks of the field trial and how they may impact different members of the community. Now, as procedure is fair, if we think of fairness in terms of not just the outcome, but the process or procedure, if the stakeholders have the opportunity for meaningful input into decision making. So this is kind of like the whole idea of democratic process and all that we've talked about earlier. So input is meaningful if it can substantially affect the outcome of the decision. So again, we get back to the issue of shared decision making, and we looked at it from sort of a democratic point of view, but it also seems to be important from this sort of environmental justice point of view that people should have, be involved to have meaningful input into the decision. So let's look at some sort of guidelines then for bringing about this effective community engagement. One of them is timeliness. So it should begin very early in the planning process to give community members enough time to process information, ask questions, discuss the study with the neighbors and friends, and so on. It should not be a fait accompli or something like that, done at the last minute. Consent. The community should have the right to give its permission, consent, or approval. Studies should not occur without consent. Again, engaging the community early on in the process can help promote the notion of concept of consent and honoring their wishes. Information sharing. So it's not only should be consent, but it should be informed in the sense that the community can be informed. The researchers, public health officials, and so on should share the relevant information with community members, and the community members should communicate their needs and interests and concerns to the researchers or officials. So it's really a two-way street when it comes to information sharing. I think they should also be willing to share the results of the community study with community members when it's completed and any new information that might be relevant to their welfare. They should try to describe any scientific concepts in lay language and provide supporting documents and materials community members would want. Transparency. Information sharing should be honest and open. Researchers and officials should not hide important information or obfuscate important information before, during, or any part of the intervention or project. It should be available to people on, for instance, publicly accessible websites. Responsiveness. Researchers and officials should actively listen to community members and respond to their questions and concerns. They should be available to meet with community members at mutually convenient time and place. They should be willing to revise their objective procedures and research designs in response to community concerns or abandon them if the community does not accept them. So this is really part of the consent idea that, you know, this project, although we planned it, we're willing to change it in the middle of things if you have this particular concern, if you don't think it should go forward unless we make this particular change to it. Mutual understanding. Researchers, officials, community members should seek to understand each other's point of view concerning the proposed intervention or project. And researchers should make special efforts to understand why community members oppose a project or an intervention. And this also relates to another, I think, important principle is respectfulness. Researchers, officials, and community members should respect each other's values, attitudes, opinions, beliefs, even when they disagree. Researchers should not belittle or denigrate community beliefs, opinions, or attitudes such as philosophical opposition to GMOs, even if they view them as irrational or unscientific. So I think this is an important point. I think there's a tendency among scientists and public health officials when community members oppose something like this because they don't like GMOs or whatever, to treat them as ignorant people that don't know what they're talking about and to not really engage them further at that point. But I think it's really important to try to understand what these positions are and how they affect people's decision making and show them respect. Inclusiveness. Everyone in the community should have an opportunity to participate in the decision-making process regardless of income, education, race, ethnicity, gender, and so forth. There should be efforts to reach out to socially disadvantaged members of the community and minorities. We talked about that earlier with sort of enhancing the democratic decision-making process. Okay, so let's look at a couple of case studies where we've had community engagement. So, as I mentioned Oxitec earlier, they did their first release of GM mosquitoes in the Cayman Islands in 2009 and 2010. At that time, the country had no regulations concerning the release of GM mosquitoes into the wild. Although they obtained approval from the country's Mosquito Research and Control Unit, they neither consulted nor obtained consent from the local community. Critics argued the local community should have been involved in decision making. And they did do a little bit more community consulting with these field trials, but this is probably an example where there was very little community consultation in something like this. Okay. Let's go to another example, and this is Brazil, where we have much better community consultation. So in Brazil, Oxitec researchers conducted field trials of these mosquitoes in 2011 to help reduce dengue fever. They obtained approvals from the Brazilian National Biosafety Technical Commission in 2010, and they designated 5 sites for potential field trials. Local public health authorities and community leaders consented to the project. So if you're talking about, the political process, those are the people that were involved in the political process here. Public engagement took place via announcements in the media, including social media, distribution of posters and leaflets, meetings with community members, and presentations at schools. The project also employed technicians to go door to door to answer questions from residents and learn more about their opinions and concerns. And I think that's one of the most interesting parts of the community engagement is actually, to go really door to door. It's one thing to hold a public meeting, but it's another to really actually go door to door, talking to people. And And members of the community expressed strong support for the field trials. So I think this is an example of good in community engagement. Well, let's look at sort of what happened in the United States. So following the outbreak of dengue fever in Key West, Florida in 2010, the Florida Keys Mosquito Control District publicly announced it was considering a proposal to release Oxitex GM mosquitoes. In June 2012, researchers surveyed 400 residents of Monroe County, Florida, concerning their opinions about the proposed field trial. Among those who had heard about it, 9.7% were strongly opposed, 8.2% were opposed, 25.1% were neutral, 22.1% were supportive, and 34.9% were strongly supportive. So, looking at those numbers, it seems like there's pretty much support for this field trial. After the survey was conducted, the Florida Keys Mosquito Control District engaged community in various ways, such as making public announcements in various media and delivering presentations to various local audiences and holding public meetings. So they did some community engagement in this case. But public perceptions of the proposed field trials began to change as many residents expressed concern about potential public health and environmental risks of releasing GM mosquitoes into the wild. Monroe County resident Mila Meyer collected over 170 online signatures on a petition opposing the release of mosquitoes. 170 online signatures. Well, that's actually something like 3 times the population of Monroe County, right? So we're talking about people from outside Monroe County that were starting to, becoming concerned about this and signing things like this petition. The petition, actually it's 3,200 is the size of Key Haven. So most of the signers came from outside the community. So some of the concerns cited in this petition were that releasing this could destabilize the ecosystems I talked about earlier. If you drive this species to almost 5 minutes,
Yeah.
okay, we're almost done. Extinction, it could increase, there was others that were concerned they could cause the mosquitoes to carry a more virulent form of dengue. And so, a lot of the opposition came from environmental activists that were outside of the community. Someone who, I guess, has more scientific credentials is John Morris, physician John Morris, circulating a letter expressing the concern the mosquitoes could carry antibiotic-resistant bacteria due to exposure to tetracycline, and petitioned Oxitec to release information about antibiotic resistance in its mosquitoes. In response to this request, Oxitec researchers said they had thoroughly studied the issue and the risk of mosquitoes infecting the human population with antibiotic-resistant bacteria was negligible. Probably they're right, but it certainly looks to me like that is not a far-flung concern, because they would be exposed to tetracycline in the laboratory, and so there is at least some concern that this could be an issue, and you could be developing these so I think it's definitely something that would need to be studied more. Rumors with no basis in scientific fact began to emerge. Some people claim the recent Zika outbreaks came from Oxitex GM mosquitoes, and some feared the bite from one of Oxitec's mosquitoes could make a child sterile. Distrust of the federal government, biotechnology companies, GMOs, and scientists played a big role in turning the tide against the field trials. A survey of Key Haven residents in 2015 found that most had a negative opinion of the field trials. So this is a very interesting study, and initially they looked like they were in favor, then a lot of this public opposition came, and now people are turning against the field trials. Now, in 2016, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration had approved Oxitec's plans to do these field trials, concluding they did not pose a threat to public health or the environment. Residents of Key Haven, however, voted against allowing the field trials to take place in their community, but Monroe County voters passed a referendum to approve the field trials, and Key Haven is in Monroe County. Florida residents voted in favor of allowing the field trials. In November 19th that year, Monroe County Mosquito District Control approved the field trials. So the EPA has extended the public comment period on these proposed field trials. I think it was extended. It's already over, but it was extended. I don't know what the outcome of that is. But I do know that as of now, field trials of these GM mosquitoes in Florida have not begun. Okay, I'm going to stop that here because these are some interesting questions for discussion, but we need time for whatever discussion you want. So I will stop and we can just talk the rest of the time.
Okay. Questions?
I've got a question. I've already gotten to ask you a lot of questions today, but this one is truly from me. One of the things that's been helpful for me in thinking about genetically engineered solutions, technologies, is to think about how they operate as alternatives to existing solutions or technologies. And so your description of the community engagement practices that strikes me as being wonderful, but also that most of the current approaches for pesticide use would fail those descriptions. For example, mosquito abatement boards, irrigation districts, drainage districts are famous in American history for being undemocratic institutions that I don't think do this sort of outreach. So I wonder, is that part of the conversation when we talk about the ethics of these, that there's a much higher bar for the genetically engineered solutions?
That's a really
or
good,
seems like a higher bar.
I mean, that's really, and maybe the argument should be that this bar should be applied to these other public health interventions. I remember living in Laramie, Wyoming, and during the summer, these trucks would come and spray all these pesticides in the alleyways to control mosquitoes. And I'm thinking, I never gave permission for that. Now, they may have been doing it because they're the public health authority, mosquitoes are a problem, they've decided mosquitoes are a problem we need to deal with, and this is how we're going to deal with them. And so I think for a lot of public health things, there does seem to be this sort of non-democratic sort of decisions made at the top by somebody on whatever board or empower the local public health officials to do these interventions in the community. But you're right. I think that if we, probably I was more at risk from them spraying that pesticide right in my trash can in Laramie than those people are having that mosquito release down in Florida, right? So, yeah, I mean, I would say there really should be more community engagement for other kinds of public health things that may be affecting people. Yeah.
So I don't know that I'm going to frame this right, but I want to go back to your discussion of majority and minority rule.
Yeah.
And because I'm wondering, a good amount of the conflict is that we have this winner-take-all system. Majority rules, and then it's going to happen, and so minority, too bad. We might be able to assuage you by incorporating you into these engagement activities, but at the end of the day, you're not going to get what you want. But I noticed that when you were talking about majority and minority rule, you posed two decisions. One, do field trials, or the other, don't do field trials. And can we imagine a greater range of options where people could have maybe rank order voting or something along these lines, and so that instead of just a yes, no, win, lose, people could have a little bit more invested in the process because they might get something out of it.
I mean, that's a good point. Certainly giving people more options, right? If you could vote on, say, the area, the size of the area where the field trial is, maybe it's not yes, no, but it's like yes to this type of field trial, yes to this type of field trial, or whatever. Giving people more options might then make people in the minority feel like their opinion mattered more, right? As opposed to just a yes, no. Yeah. You and then, yeah.
Just following up on Matthew's point, if you compare like mosquito control, like sort of conventional mosquito control in like the U.S. compared to other countries, I worked a fair amount in East Africa and West Africa on spray programs for malaria, and the term community sensitization is used a lot, and it's almost taken as a given in Africa and a lot of the African countries I've worked with. Like, they just assume, oh, okay, well, if we're going to do this spray program, we have to do community sensitization. And you contrast that with the U.S. experience where you're talking, like, a lot of people don't even know what's going on, but what the Public Mosquito Control Board is doing. So I'm just wondering, if you're comparing Brazil and Florida, what's the history in this Brazilian community of community engagement with prior forms of control compared to what it looks like here? And do you know what that?
No, I don't, but two things I think are different there. One, I think the prevalence and the risk of dengue was much greater.
Yeah.
And so they were just really much more motivated to do something about it, where I think a lot of the Florida residents thought, yeah, well, you know, there is some dengue fever around here, but it's really not, I'm not too worried about it, right? So that's a big deal. But I also think, I just don't know how well the environmental groups are organized in, say, Brazil as opposed to the U.S. Whereas, you know, in the U.S. we have a huge environmental movement, well organized, to, you know, express their view on things like this and influence the outcome of decisions like this. Yeah.
Yeah, my comments were actually going to focus on those considerations of risk and reward, where the disease prevalence, I think, is clearly higher in Brazil. And you know,
Yeah.
my uncle lives in the Keys. I'm from Florida.
Yeah.
It's a fun place to be. It's a strange place to be. But like, you know, he would love, for example, if a lot of he thought this could get rid of mosquitoes. He didn't know there was more than one species of mosquito. He was really excited about it, and he was actually upset when he realized it was only this like one narrow species that carried this disease he couldn't tell you anything about. And I would argue a lot of citizens in Florida and in the Keys couldn't tell you what dengue symptoms are. They're not familiar with it. Zika raised the profile, but you know, it's just that risk is not necessarily perceived, and when you're told that that is the main thing, the benefit you're getting out of it, it's just not super convincing for some people down there.
Right.
And another point of clarification I wanted to make in terms of this tyranny of the 51% and things like that, right, is when the Florida Monroe County voters voted in favor of these trials, they did not vote it in favor in Monroe County. They voted it in favor in Key Haven. So the rest of the county actually okayed it to be done in Key Haven. Key Haven was actually listed in that referendum, right? And so this not in my backyard sort of thing is I think, totally part of this.
Right.
And so they had no real stake in the risks.
Right.
Right? There was a huge discussion on how little these things move out of a certain area. It's pretty well the information given should emphasize that it was going to be fairly contained, so that they were at no real risk, and they got all of the benefit from figuring out if it works or not, and y'all go for it there. And they may have inadvertently opened themselves up to having it in their backyard by voting it in someone else's backyard. So there's a lot of nuance in that story, I think, that needs to get.
No, that's a good point, and thanks for bringing that out. Yeah.
So you gave a nice description, a reminder of democracy and majority rule, and it's kind of going back to what Nora was talking about. And then you went into environmental justice, and it just seems like there's a conflict that can't be resolved between those two camps. Do you have thoughts on how to be able to do both?
No. I do, but I'm really not sure. I think there really is a big conflict. The problem is, not in my backyard means in nobody's backyard. But we have to have it in somebody's backyard. Let's say, like we want to put a new trash dump somewhere in some county, right? We got to have some place to put our trash. But if everybody's, saying not in my backyard, and that's sort of like the environmental justice point of view, right? It's not fair to impose this trash dump on people that are, going to be living near the trash. But at the same time, the majority, they need somewhere to put their trash, right? So it's a really big tension, and I don't know how to really solve it totally, except to give people a say. But then, you know, what does that mean if they don't really get to make the decision in the end, right? They're not really having, what does having a say mean, right? So, yeah.
Well, I was just wondering how, so one of the questions I had for you earlier was, do we really have the infrastructure in this country to carry out this kind of ethical consultation? Because when you talk about kind of trash, and my mind goes to, well, how much would it cost? Like, how much would people be willing, how much money would people take to have it in their backyard? And so if you think about, say, you know, middle and upper class, obviously they're going to say, look, the going rate to put trash in my backyard is X amount. Like, okay, then that should be the going rate to put trash in somebody's backyard. And then it becomes more of a leveling mechanism, and poor people aren't saddled with it. You know?
That's
Yes.
Economics.
Well, you know, economics is relevant to the question, and you know, some I think communities have said they want trash in their backyard so that they can benefit from the jobs that brings. And even some countries have said, give us your trash, right, your electronic waste or whatever, so that we will, you know, get some economic benefits out of it. But then that still leaves you the question, well, if these people weren't so poor in the first place, they wouldn't be asking for the trash.
That's why I went to
Right,
the
so-
middle class example.
What?
That's why I went to the middle class
Yeah.
example. Yeah. But my other question was, do you think we actually have the infrastructure to carry out the ethical community engagement that you've outlined today?
No, I don't think so. Because if you really think about community engagement as a concept in public health and everything, it's not very, it's very new in terms of the conceptual legal landscape and everything, and so I don't think we really have the infrastructure. It's something that has to be developed. Yeah.
I think this minority-majority thing is a really interesting question. I was watching when you were giving the description, it was like, if a community decides that it wants it, but a minority, a strong minority, doesn't want it, you know, is this an issue of justice and all, and
Yeah.
how do you do it? But if you turn that around, if I have had 3 kids who just died of malaria before they were 5, and the community votes against it, but I'm more, you know, which one is about, you know, I don't know, I just want to bring up that there's a flip side to that. And I see that with the pesticide use as well, because we've had occasions where the community sort of decides against spraying an insecticide, and it's the farmers who suffer because of that. So I think, you know, the thing goes both ways, but we'll usually think about it.
No, I think you're right. Well, if you had, let's suppose you had enough private land, right? And it was a private resort and everything, let's say, and you had but you were still a minority, right? Could the majority say to you, you cannot release these genetically modified mosquitoes on your private land? And let's say if you didn't isolate your private island, let's say that's really isolated, right? So that's how we would sort of get the minority-majority thing going in a different direction, right?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
It depends upon the socioeconomic class of those
Right.
citizens and how you make it.
Yeah.
I mean, those are all hard questions.
They are.
Well, Fred's comment is making me think that, JD aside, maybe the legal framework really isn't the framework in which to make these decisions. And I'm thinking about I've dabbled in readings on peace and justice. And one of the things they talk about in those kind of post-conflict peace-building processes is gauge the depth of the no. So it doesn't just matter, you know, that a minority is saying no, but gauge the depth.
Yeah.
And what's behind there, and how important is that? Because in a peace and conflict, from a peace and conflict framework, you don't want to live next to somebody who's permanently mad at you,
Right.
even if they are the minority. That's not fun. But in a legal framework, yeah, we live next to minorities who are not necessarily represented. So it makes me wonder if a legal framework is even the best framework to talk about this.
Yeah.
I just have a question about the information. You presented a lot of different surveys in the 2 case studies, and my early understanding of some of the engagement Oxitec was doing was that they were not saying that these mosquitoes were genetically engineered. And I think that might have changed, but I know some of their videos don't mention it either. They say like lab-raised sterile insects. So did you compare the information
No, I didn't.
provided? Yeah, that might be interesting
That
to
is-
do.
I actually didn't know that, because when I've gone to Oxitec's website,
yeah.
they're pretty,
Yeah.
transparent about it.
Yeah, I think this was the early days.
But maybe
like
not years
8
ago,
years
when
ago or
it's,
so,
why,
yeah.
why would they need to be transparent if they don't have anybody making them transparent?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the other thought I had about minority majority is like pregnant women are affected by this a lot. And so should they count more, how would you count them more than everybody else, right? So that was another example I thought of the
Or children, for
subpopulation.
example,
Or
children more
True,
susceptible
true,
to
yeah.
malaria, to the effects of malaria than adults. I mean, so yeah, that's a good point.
So
Yeah.
one last question, and a
Yes.
student. Jen, you count as a student. If there's no other questions. Barely, but
Well, I
you do.
can, hopefully. So, one of the differences I think I saw between the Brazil and the Florida is that Brazil actually, to me, it felt like it was propaganda
Mhm.
instead of just information. And so where does the line between education, role materials, and propaganda start? And where should you fall on the use of those?
So you consider what Brazil, you're
So
thinking what
Brazil
Brazil
had
did?
that little song,
Yeah.
that was really cute, and the children singing, and "Don't kill me" or something like that. And I think at least what I saw was maybe not as transparent, but more factual in the Florida case, and less emotional.
Yeah, well, it's a good point, but I think scientists and public health officials have a right to engage people emotionally, not just rationally, and maybe they do need to engage people emotionally, not just rationally, as part of the process. So let me just think of an example where it doesn't seem so bad. You're all familiar with those NASA press conferences, right? NASA has some of the best PR of any scientific organization. People love those things, right? When NASA talks about, we're doing this, we're doing that, we've seen this, we've seen that, and they get some really articulate scientists up there to talk, and they show all this wonderful stuff, and the public is sold on it. Now, tell me that that's not partly propaganda. Or there's some element of emotional, that NASA is engaging at least in some element of sort of emotional persuasion that's not entirely rational, right? We're not just throwing the facts out there. We're trying to get you to be emotionally involved with with space, right? So you raise the interesting question though, where as a scientist, where you draw the line between sort of, engaging people emotionally in the subject, and then stepping over the line and really engaging in propaganda or, some kind of unethical rhetoric or something where you're really trying to just, snow people, right?
Well, let's thank David for sparking a really good